You know I'm totally off script right now.
Point of order.
We are traversing uncharted territory.
Listen properly.
Are we in an auction here?
We are now required to rise.
Honorable member.
Just a joke, but it's true.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression.
Please, Russia, please!
It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore.
Get us Hillary Clinton's emails.
Call on all of us,
Just leave us alone.
one and all,
Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
to play our part.
I want you to get mad.
The faith of this nation is eternal.
And my vice president has shot someone.
Good morning. Welcome to the third, as in fourth, episode of Let's Talk, and to a living history of the most insane times lived through in the last at least 81 years. I am Neil de Villiers, and in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings universe, I am an Ent. Joining me in studio after the end of his quarantine, it is my pleasure to welcome back the yodeling Johannes Landman, who is...
This was a matter of great and deep thought, and it was between the Ent and the wizard. I went wizard.
Very good, very good. As well as the rampant Rob Cass, who is...
I'm a dwarf, short, squat, and I'd be happiest in a cave in the mountain.
And finally, with a signal that is traveling from his voice into a cable, into a satellite, back into a cable, and then through to my computer, and then going from there all the way through some DI boxes into a mixer, into another computer and recording there, and then all the way back to him, we have Anachronistic Andrew Park, who is...
Good day. I've been in the closet for far too long. I am a dwarf in an elf's body. I've always known it. I've never told anyone because I've been ashamed. But I'm not attracted to women without beards. I am in love with that Scotch accent. And call me a racist, call me what you want, but I'm gonna live my life as me from this day forward.
I applaud you. So, I applaud you for that, Andrew.
Bravo.
Thank you for the question. It wouldn't have happened without you, Neil.
To our listeners, we should probably remark that is a completely apt description, seeing as how Andrew is a tall, slim, gorgeous, elfin-looking character. He could stand in for Legolas if he had blonde curls. But he has the fucking aggro of a dwarf.
and that's what you need, is that aggro. 20 points for anyone who can tell me what anachronistic means.
Fail.
Out of place in time.
My man. Did you look it up? Be serious.
No. Anachronism. It's like the British monarchy. It's like something from medieval times.
Brilliant.
Or something from the future, I think, can also be an anachronism.
We should do quiz nights, I think. So yeah, chronologically misplaced. How gorgeous is that?
Touche.
And I think we all
should listen to the Dresden Dolls, man. Like, I get all my vocabulary knowledge from weird songs, and Dresden Dolls had a song called Girl Anachronism.
Oh.
Which
so you knew as well?
I wasn't able to say it as well as Andrew could say it, but I knew it was just out of time,
out of place in time.
But
yeah,
I can't. My brain and mouth are not connected very well today.
Well, so it goes. But I think everyone's feeling a little anachronistic, hey? Like you're kind of trapped in a time that's not your own, or
dystopian future.
And it's just so weird that's the case. Anyway,
today we talk beer, and beer. We discuss the taxi industry and dealing with the mafia. And Neil is uncharacteristically optimistic. And we all enjoy it.
Oh, let's get ready to rumble! Anyway. It wasn't as good as last week's.
Gentlemen, 6, maybe 6.5.
It wasn't as good as last week's, I don't think. I am taking the optimist's corner for today. And I'm really hoping that Johannes will stick to the script and pick up the cynic angle. There have been some really good things this week. The first is the opening of an entire industry. The hospitality industry has been deemed by government to be worthy of reopening. I wonder how they decide these things. But praise be to the South African government. Seriously, we all needed this, and it's just a tiny sliver of hope in a hurricane. And I like that. Eskom, my boy, has brought a massive civil lawsuit against a bunch of people, and this is going to be fun because every person on this list forms part of my fuck you list. Brian Molefe. Can we have a drum roll? Don't give us a drum roll there. Brian Molefe. Ano Singh. Machele Koko. Ben Gubane. Mosa Benzizwane. And Salim Essa. Fuck the lot of you. And finally, Tony, Atul, and AJ Gupta have reserved a special place in hell and the absolute biggest fuck you for you, you dubious, dishonest, slithery, thieving scum.
Touche, ladies and gentlemen, and our nomination for the congressman from Gauteng is...
I just want to know what their poker game in prison's going to be like. A whole bunch of guys that are used to playing poker with a bunch of money but no knowledge, and then are going to have no knowledge and no money.
No knowledge and no money. I mean, do they still issue you with cigarettes in prison? Do you guys know?
Not under lockdown. You might get some matches if you're lucky.
Matches are nice. Here we go. So I think it's cool that the state and the SIU are pursuing these civil cases, and according to experts, a significant amount of this money will be recovered, though it'll come nowhere close to the 3.8 billion rand that they're looking for. In addition, this will bankrupt companies and individuals who are involved in this rubbish, something which the criminal cases would take years to do, if at all.
Oh, yeah. It came as quite a shock to me in reading that Mr. Molefe, let's all remember that he broke down in tears at a certain public hearing when he read about the public protectors nominating him in the document. A certain Mr. Molefe has still not repaid the 10 million rand after-tax pension payout that he received from Eskom after working there. I forget for how long, but I think it was sub 3 years.
Which we all forgot about, Joe.
I haven't. I want my money.
I'll be honest. I forgot about it. There's been so much
you should
stuff.
go to the trade unions and be like, gentlemen, do you know that the very fund that you pay into each month, the very GPF that you feel so strongly about government using to fund infrastructure projects that you want to like betoog in the streets, do you know that 10 million of your rands were paid to Mr. Molefe?
For nothing.
For nothing.
Very nice. And finally, two things which my compatriots might think are negative news, but in a roundabout way, to me at least, are actually quite positive. Heineken and SRB have shelved a total of 11 billion rand of new investment in the SA economy. They're saying they were going to build plants, employ thousands of people. I know the one was in Northern KZN. I don't know where the other one was going to be. But if you as the government can't give them a clear roadmap of what's going to happen, even given their utmost attempt at cooperation with you, well, you're going to have to kiss that money goodbye. So this is a form of a power play from an industry, and it ties in really nicely in what we're in our main segment this evening. But I like it. I really like it.
Why?
What you got, Joe? You're going to shoot down my cynical reverse optimism with some true optimism.
No, I'm going to get COVID again and stay away for 2 weeks. I'm loving you taking the optimist's corner. I mean, you know. But why do you think it's a positive thing?
Why do you think it's a positive thing?
I imagine for the same reason you do,
reason.
which is it's a slap to government in the face to say there are actual concrete repercussions on absence of policy certainty and frankly this very kind of opaque story with the alcohol ban, which I think we have covered before.
Interesting
I
that you
wonder
use
if it was
that word.
coordinated, you know, the closeness of those two announcements.
Definitely.
Whether it seems to be
I'll tell you
coordinated.
something else. Most of the SAB staffers who left after the AB InBev takeover all work at Heineken. So there is a kind of old boys club of revolving doors, and I would imagine they do talk to each other, be it over WhatsApp or at the country club or at the
they are
driving
also
range.
formally talking to each other with the Beer Association of South Africa.
Aha.
So, the second thing, which people might find negative, but which I see as massively positive, is that this week I've been hearing numerous stories from all over the country of people just giving a massive middle finger to the government in terms of the liquor ban. Pick and Pay owners are bootlegging the stuff out of their stores. Bars and restaurants are selling it out of teapots, 0% beer bottles, appetizer cans, and any other opaque receptacle they can get their hands on.
Please, can I get in here?
And the government isn't seeing a cent of that money.
I have recently heard about my favorite meal. A friend of mine went out and paid 380 rand for a bowl of olives. She got a complimentary bottle of Sauvignon Blanc.
So is this a bad thing? Yes, but it hits them where it hurts. The only way the government of South Africa listens is when you strong-arm them into a position that they can no longer deny, diffuse, delay, misrepresent, or misconstrue. This is what happened with e-tolls. This is what is happening currently with tax revenue. Civil disobedience might currently be our strongest bargaining tool with the state, and we should use it and never forget it. That's call for celebration in my camp, and that is the positive slant on the morning rant.
I applaud.
Now, maybe
wholeheartedly.
government should ban more things, and then hopefully each industry will come in and offer to sweeten the pot, and government can just snap up all their offers to invest at once.
Well, I mean, they were offering to sweeten the pot beforehand, Andrew, but during this deepest period of the lockdown, the alcohol industry and the tobacco industry were trying, man. And now it's difficult for them to give concessions in order to operate, but they were doing that. But they've obviously reached the point where they realize that it doesn't matter what they say, it doesn't matter how much money they say they're going to spend or put directly into medical facilities or whatever. It doesn't matter that they were complying all the way up until the ban. When the ban hit, they realized all of that effort that we put into that was worth nothing, and the government is just going to do whatever they want anyway.
So yeah, you mentioned both Heineken and SAB, who are both brewers, and the actions that they're taking against the alcohol ban. I'd like to carry on with the theme of beer, which will form a lot of what I talk about today and forms a lot about what I talk about anyway. But today, the 6th of August, 2020, is International IPA Day. Woo! Which is normally quite a big celebration in the world of beer geeks. But unfortunately, today is not going to be that because of the alcohol ban. International IPA Day is always the first Thursday in August, and it's to celebrate what many consider to be the greatest beer style in all its hoppy glory. For those who don't know what an IPA is, it stands for India Pale Ale. It's a form of pale ale which is characterized by having a hell of a lot of hops in it. It's a beautiful, beautiful beer. And it's something worthy of celebration. And it's just very, very sad that those of us who haven't got enough stock can't be celebrating IPA Day today.
Oh, what a tragedy, but what a beautiful tragedy.
Fortunately, I am not one of those people. And I do have some stock, and we are currently drinking an IPA.
A delicious IPA.
Cue applause!
Some of us. Not everyone.
We need to organize some sort of courier system so that we can get some beer down to you, Andrew.
S'il vous plaît.
Listeners, I do not drink beer. I am a drinker of wine, but I am now going to see if while you listen to Rob and Neil, I can find one of those IPAs floating around the office. Please excuse me.
Yeah, IPA, man. It's crazy to think that beer can cause so much hardship. Either way, whether you really like drinking it and you want to drink it, or whether you're in a abusive relationship or you have an abusive kind of home setup. It's crazy that we've brought it to such an extent. And I suppose the same thing could be said about tobacco. You know, it was a ritualistic kind of thing that was done every so often, and that was turned into cigarettes like the one I'm smoking now, and it became an addiction for us.
This sounds like a perfect time for a tangent gavel.
I was waiting for it, like Thor reaching for Mjolnir. Yes! We'll take that one offline, shall we? Our next talking point, ladies and gentlemen, if we are sticking to the script I was handed upon entry to the building, is a titbit from Andrew.
Can we say tit?
Indeed, and now for something completely different. The youth of Thailand have flipping had it, and they're making this known in some very interesting ways. Now, before I go into detail, you might find it interesting to know that since 1976, Thailand has had 6 military coups. This is how the current Prime Minister came to power, so they're fairly familiar with military rule and occasional violent crackdown on opposition. It is here that our story begins. Large demonstrations have taken place in Bangkok, with similar ones, smaller though, being held across the country, following the theme of fighting injustice. And it turns out that for these young people, the most powerful symbol of the struggle against injustice is, you guessed it, Harry Potter.
That's awesome.
Yes, protesters have taken up their wands, witches' hats, and cloaks of play invisibility, vowing to cast a spell for democracy. They've also lifted, as if by Wingardium Leviosa, the theme song of a Japanese cartoon chronicling the adventures of Hamtaro, the hungry hamster, changing the lyrics to compare Hamtaro's enthusiasm for sunflower seeds to their government's craving for, quote, delicious taxes. Running in circles at protests, a symbol of Hamtaro's hamster wheel, has also gained popularity. But there's more. When authorities told protesters to go home and help their parents, with what, I'm not sure, some began to arrive with dishes and soapy water to perform their chores on site without so much as a Scourgify spell to help them. At some point, rubber chickens also joined the fray. Unfortunately, my Revelio spell failed to uncover the logic behind that decision, but presumably the authorities understand the insult. At the very least, the police might be less likely to brutalize a fantasy cosplayer in full regalia, wielding a squeaky chicken and reeling from 3 straight hours of running in circles, than they would a protester in jeans and a hoodie. The protesters' methods seem sound, but what about their demands? They want Parliament dissolved, the Constitution revised, an end to political repression, and less power for the monarchy, including the abolition of a law that can get you jailed for up to 15 years just for speaking ill of the king. So far, the law has not been enforced against protesters, but police warn that suspected offences will be investigated. Clearly, a homonym Revelio spell would be unlikely to detect much humanity in the Thai system of government. Getting back to the royal family, the adventures of the incumbent monarch could fill volumes, from throwing at least one extravagant and somewhat erotic birthday party for the royal dog, Fufu, to sporting a crop top and a half-sleeve tattoo on social media, to having his Boeing 737 impounded by German authorities in order to recoup a debt. In fairness, legal protection from ridicule may be the only thing holding this man's self-esteem together. Alas, fragility is no excuse for monarchy, and the king may soon find his cheeks ablaze with the shame of 1,000 Levi Corpus spells. In conclusion, accio democracy. May the youth of Thailand reducto every last horcrux, and at long last, expecto patronum vedementor.
That was absolutely incredible, I say, as a massive Harry Potter geek.
That was awesome.
Thanks,
Poetic.
guys.
Andrew,
That took me like half a
poetic.
day.
Gotta look up all the spells, eh?
Yeah, I try to make it so you can understand even if you're not a fan, but people can tell me how well that works.
People who are not fans of Harry Potter can understand nothing.
Well, there we have it. That brings us anything but neatly to our main segment for the evening. And the question of what the hell is going on in the taxi industry. So the government offered them a 1.1 billion rand bailout. They came back and said they want 1.1 billion rand per month. And now they're saying that that's not enough. They want 4 billion rand per month because of the COVID-19 crisis. They have increased fares between 10 and 25% since the virus hit, orchestrated strikes that shut down the country. And just as a side, that ties in nicely to my point regarding civil disobedience being our number one tool against the corrupt government. And the reason for this entire problem is that government is reliant on the taxi industry, which is informal, to provide transport, which is a governmental responsibility. And I think that kind of underpins my entire point on this. We can obviously go into old Minister Razzmatazz in his Louis Vuitton suit, his Calvin Klein polo neck, and his Armani spectacles.
Julius Malema became a minister?
No, that's Fikile Mbalula.
I've seen
Saying it's regrettable that the taxi industry will be filling their taxis to 100% while still asking for 4 billion rand a month and traveling across borders.
So just to be clear, it's regrettable that 250,000 South African citizens will be breaking the law on a daily basis.
Yes.
That's the taxi driver number,
And
much less the people in the taxi.
Never mind that. What about the public health?
Touche.
They are now at bigger risk of getting COVID. But I think what we'll see is that's just like a symptom of a much bigger problem. And yeah, so it kind of led me down a path into how the hell did we get there? What are the dynamics? And is anyone actually counting the true human cost of this long continued farcical relationship?
I mean, I think one of the things for me, I mean, I think the 100% occupancy versus 70% occupancy, I think largely is symbolic. I mean, if you think a closed taxi with 70% people versus a taxi with one window open with 100% occupancy. In terms of spreading the virus, I don't think there's much of a difference there. And to play devil's advocate, I don't think it was an enforceable rule. And I can understand why. I mean, one of the arguments that has been touted the whole way through is that the way the taxi industry runs is on pretty low profit margins on their fares. And I'm sure we'll get into it, with the fact that it's not subsidized versus a lot of the other transport industries, which are. Mm-hmm. And it really, for the model to work, it needs 100% occupancy. And if it can't do that, it doesn't make sense to run. And like we've discussed with alcohol industry, for instance, if you're going to put restrictions which undermine the business activities, you then have to offer some kind of compensation.
Definitely, which they've done.
Yeah. And I mean, I think half the problem is that we talk about 1.1 billion or 1.3 billion, which sounds like a hell of a lot of money. But I think even when you look at the stats in the taxi industry, they're not accurate stats necessarily. They're best guesses. And the fact that the industry is not formalized means that it's so difficult to come in with kind of
restriction, regulation.
Well, regulation, but also any kind of help, because it can't be data-based. Yeah. So, it's anyone's best guess how much money they actually need. Yeah. No one really knows. There's no data on this.
On the point of data and money, listeners, Rob Cass sent us a fantastic 5-page PDF with riveting data points and beautiful graphs about who finances taxis in South Africa. As you can imagine, I ate that up like candy. I found it really interesting. I'm not sure if anyone else did. Anyone else? Did anyone else?
He sent it specifically for your eyes only.
So, obviously with that comes from the financing institution SA Taxi.
Which is owned by?
Partly by Santaco.
Correct.
But also
Santaco
Transaction
are who,
Capital.
for listeners?
They are one of the taxi alliances. So
the largest one in South Africa.
The largest of two. Two broad overarching bodies.
The other one being, for
the
reference,
National Taxi Alliance.
Boom. So Santaco owns 25% of an outfit called SA Taxi, which is majority owned by a listed company called Transaction Capital. In this document, just to this point about money and contextualizing, they make a couple of really meaningful points, because SA Taxi has seen a gold mine and have what they call an integrated value chain. So their biggest point for our listeners, and those of us who didn't read the 5-page document like candy, their primary business is that they lend money to taxi owners to buy a taxi. And I'll come back to that in a moment. They then also insure the taxi, have a credit scheme on the tires for the taxi, buy back old taxis, refurbish, and so forth and so on. And they obviously make the point that they're supporting jobs and helping people who otherwise wouldn't have economic opportunities dramatically enrich or at least improve their lives. I'd like to come back to that, but the point about the 1.1 billion is they tell you what the generally most used taxis are and what make they are, and it's anyone want to take a guess what make of car is the most?
Toyota.
Boom.
Of course,
by the way, Neil owns a Toyota.
The Sesfikile.
Sesfikile.
Correct. And then they say that the average, averages are dangerous numbers, but that the average repayment for that vehicle over the time span that they lend the money for is 14,000 Rand a month. So what I did is I took the 250,000 taxi drivers, I halved it, I assumed half of them are paying for their vehicle, and just to make it easier, I timed that by 14,000. And that alone will tell us what theoretically, thumbsuck, the taxi owners of this country pay monthly in installments. The number is 1.75 billion. Just interesting data point.
Yeah, so I mean, then you can kind of see that they're requiring this amount of money. The problem is that government doesn't have the money, that they're not giving any other kind of privately owned industry that kind of money, and that they don't have a leg to stand on. So they basically have to cede to the taxi owners' demands, and on top of that, they are actually able to operate at 100% capacity. So what are you giving them money for exactly? For the fact that the economy is in the toilet. Well, that's the whole world. We can start bailing out private companies, but I don't think we're about to do that in South Africa.
So interesting one. Can I hit this? To my mind, is in the little bit of reading I've done is the realization, which is obvious, but I'm a numbers guy and the data helped, that 70% of all South African commutes, including education commutes, including school kids and university children, are by taxi. And then you start to see, and Rob's going to help me with the technical term from that PhD thesis you made me read that I only got 50 pages into. You start to see a para-something network, but you start to see a private entity do what is a really essential public service.
Yes.
And that does muddy the water somewhat.
And that is why, a part of the reason why they hold so much power.
Correct. The other part is they're a bunch of thugs, violent, gangster thugs.
Yeah, and I think barring anyone else wanting to jump in, that kind of brings us into the history of why the thing is like it is. So, obviously, looking back into where we came from gives us an idea of why we are where we are. And it's an industry that was born illegally in an illegal system. It was set up in the apartheid era in order to transport workers from far-flung, demarcated, in air quotations, areas into towns and cities so that they could work and earn a living. The industry has thus always favored function over form or regulation.
And is used to existing outside of legal parameters.
100%.
It's a culture thing.
100%. In 1987, the government deregulated the industry and basically created a free-for-all. And I wouldn't have used those words. A dissertation that I read by Professor Lee Randall uses those words. In so doing, they entrenched and legitimized all the poor conditions, precedents, and shadowy dealings of the era before, and the industry thrived during this unregulated era. They created new and longer routes, cornering parts of the market that were never served before and could definitely not be served by the state.
Can I jump in there? Apologies. And what I found interesting about that may have been in the 50 pages I managed to get through, was that, one, you've said it already, government didn't service those geographies. Of course they didn't. They were the apartheid government. So you had a gap in the market to be filled by private sector. The second thing was, for a great many people, and I confess as a middle-class white man, I can't fully comprehend this. I can understand the idea, but not the reality. This was, for large swathes of communities,
Definitely.
the only way to earn a living and possibly become fairly wealthy.
Well, there's a lot of good things about this industry that I am going to get into. But yes, you're 100% right. So, in the absence of state regulation, taxi operators formed local taxi associations, which we've kind of touched on already, which regulated loading practices and prices. And if the big red flags went up in your head right then, you're right. They're a cartel. The same as OPEC, and we support them, and they're legitimate, and they kind of pay tax and whatever. So deregulation created huge competition in the industry, and especially since this was one of the first ways for black people to create and sustain wealth in a kind of transitioning South Africa and then in post-democracy South Africa. And this exacerbated taxi violence, which was already being stoked by the apartheid government, something that I didn't know, but which makes obvious sense to you if you think about it, in order to create rifts between the industry and between black people in general. But over the same period, safety issues became a massive concern, and taxi wars became a usual occurrence, with law enforcement often being bribed and turning a blind eye to the roadworthiness, driver's licenses, etc.
Could I test something with my fellow listeners, speakers? I mean, my impression reading this stuff, and you know it, but again, you kind of interface with it, was this is the mafia. You know, it's a protection racket, it's a turf racket, it's violence, it's, I mean, did
Politics.
you guys...
Yeah, exactly
it's
that.
politics enforced by violence and politics that understands only violence. Did you guys have a similar, if I use the word mafia or gang?
Absolutely. It is just absolutely that. The fact that they control entry into the market. As you say, there's protection rackets involved. The fact that they're involved with government in the sense that government hands out, as we spoke about, hands out the
Permits?
Permits, that's the one. Government hands out the permits and helps to set all the routes. And so obviously there's incentive then for these organizations to pay off government or exert a level of control over that government function. And then as we spoke about, they have kind of control over who joins, because to get a permit, you have to belong to a taxi association. So they can control entry into the market.
And can they also control it by controlling who can own a taxi that belongs to a certain Cartel. What did you call them?
So what they've done with the associations, I read a piece that kind of hinted at that, or not even hinted, explicitly stated, but I haven't seen it backed up anywhere else, that what they do is they don't allow drivers to be owners. And for me, that's massively problematic in terms of transforming the industry. But we'll get into that, I'm sure.
The owners act as gatekeepers towards drivers.
So the association gatekeeps access to a taxi and thus to the ability to effectively own your own business, and they gatekeep the routes and the permits and so forth, and you get this terrible.
Okay. I think it is like that, Johannes. But you must realize that, like in everything, there are good people that are just trying to make an honest day's wage. You know, there are entrepreneurs who might get attacked because they worked up a small amount of money and decided, okay, they're going to put a down payment on a taxi, and there's real complications. But also, I think it's important noting that you touched on earlier, the industry supported the creation of entire sections of our economy, be those geographical or informal sectors of our economy. The industry was a flagship of black entrepreneurship. They took children to their first day of school, years later transported those same children to their first job interview, and all the while taking their mothers and fathers to work. They charged reasonable fares, were willing to drop commuters at their houses late at night or fetch them early in the morning, and created a network the state could only dream about. The industry, like Johannes said, transports almost 70% of South Africans every day, is integral to our economy, generates over 90 billion rand annually in cash-based profit, not income, profit, and employs an estimated 600,000 people. Just let that sink in. 600,000 people. To give that perspective, how many people does SAA employ, Joe? No, down. Not
6,000. And now they're downsizing to 1.5?
Yeah, depending on where you get the number. But we must have SAA. We must have SAA. Can you imagine what you could do if you plowed all that money into the formalization of this industry? The entirety, just some more perspective, the entirety of the mining sector only employs 429,500 people.
Yo.
Edcon, which everyone is absolutely up in arms about, employs 44,000 people.
Yo.
So I mean, you know, it's fine for the government to say we want to support these people and whatever, but you need to start the process to support them. You need to first say that it's a massive issue, the way it's running now. Then you need to say it needs to be a central focus of our budget, of our kind of channel going forward, because it is the most prolific transportation mechanism in the entire country. You have to do that.
Well, I think it's interesting when you compare it to the other transport industries which government does subsidize. Okay, if we look, for instance, at SAA and we look at something like the Gautrain, which serves the middle and upper class, they're happy to subsidize that. We look at trains.
Well, they also subsidize trains and buses.
Yeah, so
which
trains
arguably serve similar.
We look at trains which serve 800,000 trips on a day compared to the 15 million that taxis do. You look at buses which provide 1 million trips a day.
Plays 15 million trips.
Versus 15 million. So the numbers are just staggering.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think we'll get more into potentially the problems around subsidizing the taxi industry as it stands and how that needs to come with some kind of reform. But yeah, just in terms of that, you know, there has to be some kind of government intervention.
Why? I mean, I agree, but
well, if we consider that this isn't working, okay, I think we've all agreed that as it stands, there's massive problems.
and
Yet
so let's list those problems. They are corrupt cartel-like leadership, and
barriers to entry in the market.
Copy.
Corrupt government officials. I mean,
standard South African problem, but copy.
But those two things go hand in hand.
And I think one of the interesting things is, you know, if you look at price comparisons, so taxis compare pretty close to subsidized services in buses and trains in terms of price. But they're obviously more convenient because they go from anywhere to anywhere. But I think the problem there is that there's no proper pricing pressure. As we discussed, it is a cartel. And so it's servicing the most vulnerable people. And I mean, like we just said here, 10 to 25% price increases just saw in its sewer. I mean, how would you be able to sustain that in any other industry? And the reason they can do it is because there's no proper competition and no pricing pressure because of that.
Now, part of the reason there's no proper competition is one, cartel behavior.
Yeah, and gatekeeping.
But two, is competition is weeded out at the barrel of a gun. Then just another point, the reason I made us... Sorry, Andrew?
It occurs to me that it's not just another industry. It's an industry that is, to a large extent, doing government's job.
Yes.
In terms of, both mitigating for spatial apartheid and at the same time moving people around, public transport for people who can't afford anything else. So I don't know, maybe it needs to be a higher priority, almost as if it was a state-owned enterprise. But then, as you say, can't be governed by violence at the same time.
The next thing I'd kind of like to discuss is the power structures and the taxi industry's relations with government as a whole. And I think the power relationship between these two parties has always been strained. And the reason, as I mentioned, is the fact that the industry literally holds all the chips at the table. I'm going to repeat my earlier statement, which Joe kind of summarized again. Andrew summarized again, which is that the government is reliant on the taxi industry, which is informal, to provide a service which government is responsible for. One example of this power-based relationship is their refusal to pay e-tolls. Just months before the initialization of the e-toll thieving system, get your heckles up, Joe. Sunroll.
I gave up on those heckles 10 years ago. I'm just drinking and laughing.
Sunroll announced that minibus taxis would be exempt from paying the tariff. This is because the taxi association said if they're forced to pay, they'd block the freeways and boycott the system, apart from the fact that they were already ramping up taxi violence in the months leading up to the system's Titanic maiden voyage. And just as a side note, and to follow my analogy, I think this might have been the final rivet in the Titanic's bow, with people, that's right, us, seeing the state flinching and deciding, we could probably make them flinch too. And I think this is freaking awesome. Post-democracy, this was one of the biggest civil society wins in South Africa, in my opinion.
Another day over a glass of wine, I would very easily get into that one. I can cite you 10 court cases that have made a bigger difference than that. But I think this is a tangent gavel.
Civil disobedience kind of win.
Oh, okay. I'll take civil disobedience. Copy that.
Yeah. And then similarly, when the National Taxi Task Team released their report in 1996, they suggested the re-regulation of the industry for the good of the country, commuters and drivers. When this process ended in 1998, it was clear the industry wasn't going to budge, with the biggest of the associations purposefully flaring up taxi violence in opposition to re-regulation. It was also clear that the industry had formed some very powerful political relationships and that these people were being paid for their silence, compliance, corruption, whatever else you want to call it.
A thought just occurred to me. You can't do business with the mafia. Well, not unless you're corrupt. And you can't stare down the mafia because you will blink first, and if you don't, they'll shoot some people, block some highways,
especially
and
when
blow
you
some
don't
stuff
hold any chips. You
Copy
have no
that.
power.
Copy that. It's a total bluff. But what you could maybe do, this is just a thought and we might edit it out, is you could buy them out. You could write a 200 billion rand check and say, you're all gone. The condition of your receiving your 20 or 30 or 40 million rand is you will, to put it politely, fuck off and never own or run a taxi business again. Then you take that over, a private sector company runs it, and you maybe get the crooks out. But I don't know if that
Okay, well, to answer that, okay, so imagine this is the New York Mafia, and government says to them, we will give you X amounts of money to stop doing what you're doing. They know, the mafia knows that currently the government cannot use the law to stop them. The government has no sway at the moment. That's why they're coming up with a desperate offer like this. So what you could do then is take the money and just not stop. So government already has no recourse.
It's a great
you know
idea.
that government has no recourse. Government's told you as much.
Yes.
And they say, we'll give you a bunch of money, but what we need you to do is walk away. But we need you to walk away. We've got no way of enforcing this.
So it's a great point, and I hadn't thought about it. I'd only pay them when they've emigrated. So when they send me proof of residence in Cairo and a picture of them and their kids sitting next to a pyramid or wherever they go, then they get their check.
So you can go to John Gotti and get into that trust relationship with him. And see how that works
It's a
out
fair
for
point,
you.
and it illustrates the point that you can't actually work with these people.
Well,
I'll
yeah,
shut up.
you started by saying you can't negotiate with a mob. Isn't that what you started by saying?
Copy
You
that.
and yeah,
And then I
that's-
tried to negotiate with the mob and it failed. Well, there we go. Ladies and gentlemen, my point has been tested
there
and
we go.
proven.
There we go. A thought experiment, a sandbox for thought experiments.
Well, I think that also raises the question with subsidies. We mentioned earlier that they were offered a subsidy in lieu of 100% occupancy. Then the law was changed to say, okay, you can have 100% occupancy, and they're like, well, what about the subsidy?
At first it was 40. Then they said, then they complied with the 40 right at the beginning. Remember? Then they said, no, we want 70. Then immediately the government changed the law. Immediately. They changed the law to 70, and then just after that, when the whole subsidies and amounts came out, they were like, actually, we will travel across borders and we will fill our taxis.
Well, that's the
down
thing.
to
That's the
70.
whole argument against subsidies, in my opinion, is that, as we've established, you can't negotiate on reasonable terms with an industry like this. So when you offer a subsidy, you're offering it up from a position of zero power.
Yeah.
And so government will then say, okay, we'll give you X amount as a subsidy. There's nothing to hold the industry accountable for that subsidy leading to price reductions or better standards for drivers. That's the whole problem.
Yeah,
here.
quite the opposite.
If you make it substantial enough, the idea would be that if you look after your taxi, you're going to get this extra money, or your taxis, you're going to get this extra money. If you don't, we'll take that money away, and you still need to operate at the fare that you were operating
Okay, but
at.
that's the whole thing I'm arguing against, is that the taxi industry, we've said their civil disobedience campaigns have been so effective. So as soon as you give something and then you say, okay, but you have to do this, and you take it away, the civil disobedience campaign is still there.
So there's one example of a thing that worked, and I don't have the exact numbers, but the program whereby you took your taxi in and got paid for it.
Yeah, the
That
recapitalization.
definitely did not work. That definitely did not work.
72,000 odd taxis went in and were recapitalized. That was extended to 130 odd thousand taxis. That number is being reached. They increased the payment from 90 odd grand to 125 grand.
Then to 140 grand.
So there's
Now, explain what that means.
They were saying
recapitalize.
in 2016 that if that thing went through and was actually successful, it would have bankrupted the fiscus. And they were talking about, it was so funny to me to read it because of all the numbers flying around for the bailouts. And they were saying 4 billion rand for the entire program.
We'll bankrupt the
And they were
fiscus.
like, it'll bankrupt the fiscus. We can't do it now. We see these bailouts and it's just billions here, hundreds of billions here. Sorry.
I mean,
So that recapitalization, the idea was, at the time, the complaint with a lot of taxis on the road is that they're unroadworthy. And the thinking was that if government provided a bunch of money for taxi operators to buy new taxis and then take on the old taxis so that they could make sure that they were taken off the road, that they could raise the general level of safety quite dramatically. I haven't seen any numbers as to what they achieved in terms of safety standards with that. But
if I could just put my point on the table for Neil to butcher meticulously, my thinking was 250,000 taxis on the road, 72,000 of those have been swapped out. That's, roughly a third, give or take. That's some success.
But
your
from
thoughts?
2006. So
okay.
so that's 14 years. I suppose in a way you could see that like that, but the government legislates that one of those taxis can be operated as a transport vehicle for 7 years. So I mean, I could drive just down this corner, and the first taxi that I would see would be one of those old Hiaces, which are 20 years old, 15 years old. So that's the one thing. The second thing is people said that the scrapping amount is not enough to incentivize owners to scrap the taxis.
And then it was increased, as you said.
It was increased from 90,000 in the recap, what I call the update with tax cap 2.0. In 2019, they increased it first from 90-something thousand to 120-something thousand, and then, so 30% huge, and then eventually to around 140,000. So they have addressed that, but there are other issues with that system. And not least of which is the fact that people get paid for scrapping the taxis and then don't scrap them because of corruption.
Oh, got you.
So and that's kind of what ties into Rob's point beautifully, because you're giving them the system to try and it's not even like we want to regulate you, we want to enact change, we're like, we'll help you help us, we'll pay for you helping us. And already the associations are like, screw it, we'll take your money and we'll still run those taxis. They'll get impounded and then we'll get them released from the impound.
I'd be very interested to see what impact that's had on safety in taxis. And I mean, one of the interesting numbers I came across, I think we all have this idea, I certainly did, that, I mean, a huge percentage of the accidents on South African roads are taxi related. And the actual number is quite astounding. So I'm going to put out the total number of road deaths in South Africa.
Per
day
year?
is 36.
Uh-huh.
How many of those road deaths do you think are associated with taxis?
3.
Joe has a data point.
Yeah,
Obviously.
Joe's seen the data.
I would have said a lot more. I would have said half.
I would have guessed 50% before I read the number.
Which is 18, eh?
Especially,
hang on,
especially
we've-
coming off like the fact that they transport 70% of people a day.
Yeah. So we've got 18, we've got 18 again, we've got 3. Andrew?
Yeah, I was going to go with the 75% as well of or what was it, 70%
Yeah,
of
70%
trips that they
odd.
handle.
So that would
are
be
we
20
saying pro
something,
rata, that's
22,
18?
23. Okay.
Yeah, it's Joe's
Is it
hit
3?
the nail on the head. Three out of 36 deaths on the road
A day.
Because I
Are
remember
related
reading
to
it and going,
taxis.
that's 8.5%, but they they handle 70% of our road, maybe not our road traffic, but our commuter trips.
Yeah.
And that's a completely disproportionate number.
It's
Exactly.
interesting.
And I think, the
very
numbers,
interesting.
I'd be interested to see what the numbers were like prior to these recapitalization
I have no data
programs.
here, but I have a thought. Some of my thoughts are based on data. And that is that death by road accident statistic or number is very, very heavily skewed thanks to the commuters, pedestrians who die.
Sure.
And I think if we were to do the 3 taxi deaths
Interesting.
as a percentage of people who die in a car, not
Joe,
people
you
who die
mean
crossing the
when you
M2.
say we, you mean you? Hey, the
Not
royal,
a
the royal.
chance,
Come on, it's the positive math corner with Johannes Landman.
We will revert next week with some positive math. God help us all.
But I mean, if they were bad drivers, they would also run over pedestrians more, presumably, right?
But the people who die are the pedestrians. The dude in the car, irrespective of the car, has statistically a much lower chance of
Yeah,
dying.
he's not dying. The statistic is whether he died, not whether. Yeah.
Although it did state that it was taxi related.
Oh, so it
I don't
might
know whether
include
they
that. It
record
would
those
include
deaths.
that. Yeah, it would include that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we'd have to see the source data to see how they recorded that. But
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway.
it forms a central tenet of this show is like investigate the data, then come here, and then people are going to shoot you down, and then you say, okay, we need to carve this little other bit out of the data actually to get a true representation. That is how you should be interacting with data, ladies and gentlemen.
The only point I'd maybe rephrase, just because Neil is like quite an aggressive anarchist by nature, and I'm like a thoughtful wizard by nature, is maybe you don't get shot down on your data. You unpack it together, and then you task one another to
we'll use
understand
words
it
like
better.
unity.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, in case you're wondering how wizards differed from anarchists, you now know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Gandalf
It's
was a
all in your
frickin' anarchist.
alignment. We've discussed numbers, and we've discussed the very negative, dark underbelly of this thing, which I call the mafia. But what I also found as the flip side of that was this incredible exploitation. So when you think mafia, you think big evil people with guns and money and corruption, and that's all there. But what's also there are the drivers whom I pity. Let me quote you some numbers. Minimum wage numbers set out in November 2017 increased for a taxi driver. This is the minimum wage from 3,200 Rand a month. Can we all slow down? 3,200 Rand a month. And that was being increased to 3,400. Another example is rank marshals. I assume they help organize taxi ranks.
Yeah.
They were going to go from $2,500 to $2,700. And I mean, the numbers just baffle you.
And it's not enforced.
So
those numbers don't matter at all.
So wait, I build on that, exactly. That was November 2017. I read a December 2019 article. I mean, this is less than a year ago, where actual drivers at taxi ranks in Joburg were earning $500 a week. $500 a week is $2,000 a month plus the minimum wage of 3-4. And then something, I mean, that just broke my heart, okay?
Definitely.
But then what really hit me was the concept of imali yesokisi. Imali is Zulu for money. I don't know what yesokisi means. I apologize. But it translates as extra funds from additional trips and drives. And suddenly my picture, and I put this, it's overtime. And I put this to our listeners. If you're a taxi driver who through this evil mafia is exploited out of owning your own business, even though you would like to, and you've got the work ethic, and you're up at 2:30, and your last trip is well after dark.
Up at midnight
You're up
is
at
the story
midnight.
that I heard, man.
And you earn $2,000 a month formally. But you can hustle. You can hustle for that extra $100, $200 a day. $200 a day times 20 working days is $4,000. That's tripling your monthly income. I'd encourage our listeners to take their gross salary and times it by 3. That is what these guys can do by hustling. And suddenly driving, past Furnos in Dunkeld on Jan Smits and being cut off by 2 taxis, I just please come in and earn your imali yesokisi.
Well, I think this point speaks to everything that tells you why taxi drivers drive the way they do. And something, just to unpack it a little further. So that 2,000 Rand that they're getting, that's what they're being paid by the owner of the taxi. And what they're expected to do as drivers is each taxi must bring in a particular return for the owner each day. And anything over and above that, like Johannes said, is free for the driver to take. Informally also, it's not necessarily something that's agreed to with the owner. So these guys are under huge amounts of pressure to meet a quota. And on bad days when they don't, then what? And as we've discussed, this is a hugely violent industry. There's no formal employment, so they're in very precarious working conditions.
I've read cases of people who don't make quota for a day, and the next day they come in and someone else is driving their taxi.
Yeah.
You're flipped. And then if you want to do something about it, well, it's the barrel of a gun.
Yeah.
So exactly, that kind of, these things tell you everything you need to know about why these guys are driving the way they are. And hell, I'd probably drive the same if it were up to me.
Yeah.
And then, over and above that, they get stuck with a lot of the operating costs. Again, they don't have recourse. So
Minor
if
repairs,
the owner
major
says to the guy,
repairs.
you are responsible for the taxi. If something goes wrong, you are responsible.
Yeah.
And that's the whole problem. These guys are saddled in a terrible situation where they have no recourse and they're desperate. And, it's a way to earn a living and you hustle. And that hustling looks like stuffing as many people into a taxi as you can, getting between destinations as quickly as you possibly can, and filling up as many trips as you can to maximize your earnings, which is still pretty meager.
And you have no opportunity to hustle, to be your own, to have your own business, to own your own taxi, to make something of yourself. That is being done by some fat cat mafia boss who only is in the position to do it because he or she, probably he, has a connection to the association. They have possibly never driven a taxi. And you for 20 years can hustle, and there's a ceiling. There's no way out of that
And
pit.
that ceiling is a short ceiling. It's not like lower level management or anything.
No, it's barely out of the
it's
janitor's
driver.
closet.
And I mean, it's important to note that they also get hassled, harangued, etc. by their customers. I mean, they get told that they need to get them to work on time, to home on time. The hassling with the fares and all of that stuff. I think it's a really difficult line of work, and I think that because of that, there's a lot of stress in it, mental, physical, etc. Stress in it, and these guys are driving around without benefits. I mean, without medical aid, without pension funds, which they're obviously supposed to pay, or is supposed to be paid for them. Leave, overtime, 13th check, days off. I mean, it's just a recipe for disaster, really.
It is slave-like, and I quote this from an article who quotes a female taxi driver who's 54 years old. It is slave-like treatment.
I think this is one example of something that kind of middle-class white folks like us tend to miss, that when you're driving and the taxi cuts you off and you think, how inconsiderate, how can someone behave that way? You don't know what it's like to live in crisis mode. you know,
Booyah.
and
All
to
the time.
constantly not, not know if you're going to be able to make ends meet
Booyah.
tomorrow night, never
Yeah.
mind this month.
Yeah.
And I think someone said something interesting to me the other day. We were talking about communicating with the average South African about things like the COVID-19 crisis and the environmental crisis and so on. And this person said, we forget that like this crisis mode is new for us, but there are communities in this country and around the world that have been in crisis since colonialism first reached them. And that really stuck with me, because it's not something that occurs to you when you're on the road judging
Definitely.
someone.
And just another point, that kind of crisis mode and that physical and mental stress and whatever, obviously causes you almost quite naturally to turn to drugs. And there are a lot of stories about taxi owners actually favoring drivers who are addicted to alcohol, nyaupe or whatever, because that guy is obviously driving for his fix. The owner is sitting outside it, knowing that he's holding that guy's fix in his hand. So he's literally got that guy's entire life kind of tied up in that little brown envelope he gives him at the end of the week. You know,
Slave
And
labor. It's like the Dorpstelsel.
I read an article that said Marx called it wage slavery. Wage slavery.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that
Wage
article
slavery.
talked to the nature of the relationship between the owner and the driver, and the fact that they need each other, but there's not a equal power relationship.
Apparently, even going back to when the slaves were released in the USA, Abraham Lincoln even said at some point that it would be no victory if they replaced chattel slavery, chain slavery, with wage slavery. So at certain points and times in history, it's been very much an active concept in people's minds.
Yeah.
I'm just going to throw this grenade in the thought pond and it can explode off camera. But
Yeah, brace.
there is probably 40 to 60% of South Africans in this country who would argue that's exactly what's happened in the last 25, 26 years.
What?
We swapped political slavery for wage slavery.
I mean, who do you expect to argue with you?
No one. It's a grenade. It's not meant to have a debate. It's meant to explode.
Well, yeah.
Our listeners must
we
go,
I think we can all agree. Oh, you mean, I thought you were going to say something that's going to piss all of us off and we must turn off the mic so that we can...
wizard who wants to discuss things. I don't want to attack or fight.
I was so prepared to be triggered.
Yeah, me too.
Oh,
Actually,
baby, I'm
me
sorry
too.
I couldn't trigger you this evening.
Maybe tomorrow night.
Virtual love affair here. I also think it's important to just state the fact that there's, like we spoke about in our last episode, there's no accountability really from customers if the driver is driving on nyaupe. There's no real recourse, because that person, like we said, that person is kind of a ephemeral part of that taxi owner's structure. You know, tomorrow he could be gone, or he couldn't, or he could be working for the next company, or he could be driving a different taxi. But they have no recourse to the actual bosses to say, listen, we don't want people that are addicted to meth driving taxis, you know, or even take a bigger stand and say, the way that you treat your drivers and the amount that you pay them, which is obviously outside the law, causes them to become dangerous drivers.
Drivers and passengers are just disposable.
Yes, because there is so much demand and you own the supply and it's limited.
Definitely. Yeah, and just one more thing, kind of in the plight of the drivers before we close that off. This Professor Lee Randall, and I'll link the dissertation in the show notes. It's really fascinating. But she says that the Department of Labor is complicit in the chaos in terms of the drivers as we see it.
Why?
There is legislation that they refuse to enforce. They don't police the industry, and they turn a blind eye to it by allowing fraudulent and illegal activity. And honestly, they should know better. 600,000 people makes a difference.
But I think that's exactly what we've kind of been building up to. The fact that the taxi industry has this power because of the number of lives that they influence on a daily basis. So if they decide en masse to not drive that day, 15 million trips that don't happen.
And it happened the
Which
other
could
day.
be,
It happened
you
the
know,
other day.
it's
It was
millions of
madness.
commercial interactions. It's millions of work days that don't happen.
Yeah.
You know, they could basically financially cripple a country
Yeah.
if they decide not to operate. And that is incredible power to have. And so government has to be very, very careful with how they interact with them.
Yeah.
And that's problematic. You
It
know,
is.
there's a completely outsized power dynamic there.
Definitely. Definitely.
I have a financial point which is completely random, but I want to state it. May I? If it's so random, you can cut it out afterwards.
I want to say no, but all right.
SA Taxi, we all remember who they are, 25% owned by Santaco and majority, more than 51% owned by Transaction Capital, listed business, and so forth. SA Taxi, during April of this year, amidst all of the 1.1 or 1.3 billion or 4 billion, all of that talk, borrowed, are you sitting down, $107 million. That's 2 billion rand, roughly, I'm rounding up a little, from the African Development Bank. This was announced on 23 April. And I just, again, it's that your drivers are being exploited as slaves, you're harassing government in mafia-like ways, and you're going to cut a deal with the SA Development Bank for, to be frank, it was $10 million of senior loan, which was approved, and $100 million, $97 million loan facility. But it's these completely different worlds. It's like the mafia listing in Italy.
Oh, yeah. How did they convince those people to lend them that money? Because they know where the power dynamic in the
I have
transportation
many
in South Africa.
nefarious
No,
responses.
it's simple. They know where the power relationship lies in South Africa between government and the taxi association.
Also, potentially, they made them an offer they couldn't refuse.
What
A
does that
brown paper envelope in one hand and a 9 mil in the other.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think that's kind of part of. I was expecting.
That's implicit.
That's implicit.
That's all I got.
I've got something to say about this, but I don't know whether to say it now or
Let's have
because it kind of ties into the moving forward part. And
Okay, let's.
you know, I think a company like SA Taxi has massive potential to be the driving force of change. I think that we can all agree that there's not going to be change in a traditional sense that government kind of exercises some kind of power. Obviously, that's not going to work. So there has to be some kind of lateral approach, and I think part of that is actually solving the underlying cause, which is the apartheid spatial planning. I think that's going to go a long way to changing the dynamic here. The second thing is to come at it from the point of saying we can't use the stick. How do we use the carrot? And a company like SA Taxi is that carrot. So they say, look, we will take basically if they're taking on the financing, you're making it a lot easier for owners. And you're allowing them to potentially expand, to operate a lot more freely. But then you can say, if I'm giving you this, they've got the power to say, well, then I want something back. So as you said, they control a big part of the value chain, which I think is fantastic because they are able to offer insurance products, which to me is one of the big ways that you can change the behavior of the taxi industry is through insurance, both because you can then offer products to say, okay, well, if there's third-party insurance, for instance, there's insurances on making sure replacing tires, fixing up the taxis, but also requiring those taxis to have new tires and be fixed up to claim on the insurance.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of behavioral change that can happen through insurance products.
That's so beautiful.
So you can drive the
That's so
change through that.
So
And then
SA Taxi has a loyalty program which drives change on exactly the points you've made, things
Exactly.
like
And
the
then-
use of tires and fuel.
And that's also where government can step in. Instead of subsidizing the industry, if government, like they do with a lot of the other state-owned enterprises, says, we're not going to give you money directly, but we will back the loans that you make. SA Taxi can scale up, or companies like it, and I think there needs to be competition in that as well, but companies like that can scale up with loans backed by the government to be able to provide this financing and change the industry that way. I think what we've all agreed is that if we look at the human cost, they need to change the ownership structure of how the industry works. And again, if you can bring it in laterally like that, you can then start to bring in these kinds of changes where you require. I think it's a lot of steps in that process, but the first one has to be to require safe workplace practices. And the way you're going to do that is by changing the dynamic on how things get paid over. So, if you're taking a lot of the financial liability off the owner, you can then allow the owner more freedom to pay fairly and require it. So you can then start bringing in better workplace practices, and that'll be a step on the way to achieving a situation where drivers are allowed to own their own taxis. And I think that will change behavior a lot as well.
Because that's the other thing we need to break is the owner-driver monopoly and enslavement.
That was going to be my question. Is that, do you think that what you're suggesting does that? Are you going to be able to police the fact that people are still going to want to not let people into the industry, that they're going to protect their roots by the point of a gun?
But that's the thing. If you change the whole dynamic of the industry, you undermine that.
It's certainly a step in the right direction.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think what it also acknowledges is that you cannot do this by regulation. It's ironic we're recording this episode in the same week that the 4 or 5 biggest technology companies in the US, who make up 20-odd% of the market cap and are blowing the market out the water, are in front of Congress and Senate hearings. Those guys are absolutely petrified. Here's the mafia of the SA taxi industry. They couldn't care less. And,
I would suggest you can. It's not that you can't do it through legislation. You can't do it through unenforceable legislation.
But then you're
and
rolling
that's the thing.
SANDF into the streets.
Exactly. So we have a situation that isn't any legislation you put in is not enforceable. So you have to come up with innovative approaches.
Listen, I'm not against the other option.
And
you wanted to give SA Taxi, what, $5 billion? If you give a bunch of retired recce's and paramilitary operators $5 billion and you say, sort out the mafia, I mean, you get the taxis for free.
So the final thing I'd like to suggest would be a massive benefit from doing something like that is, I think, the potential to gather data on this industry, and particularly geodata. So what are the most popular trips? And it could inform a huge amount of the way we plan the city going forward, the way we plan transport going forward, actually understanding what trips are happening, what is occupancy like, where are people going from and to, how regularly are they doing that? If we have a much better understanding of the traffic patterns, particularly in the taxi industry, it can really inform our transport policies going forward.
That ties in really nicely to my one suggestion, but I'm going to keep it till the end.
No, go now. No, you can't tease us like that.
I kind of just want to go through what has been done by the government. So I love your ideas, Rob, and that is in comparison to the stuff that I'm going to mention. So the National Road Safety Strategy 2016 to 2030 was approved by Cabinet, I love this, in March 2017, with an aim to drastically reduce death tolls on our roads, which is an interesting fact given our data point earlier. It mentions 5 underpinning factors: road safety management, safer roads and mobility, safer vehicles, safer road users, and post-crash response. And really, it's a great document. Another great document, whose action points still haven't been enforced. The 151-page document mentions the word taxi exactly 5 times. 5 mentions for what is by far the biggest transportation mechanism in our entire country. And here they are. The document states that it needs to improve the roadworthiness of the public transport vehicle fleet, which includes minibus taxis, collaborate with taxi associations to introduce road safety awareness and educational programs that focus on the driver, the commuter, and the vehicle fitness. The third tip of the hat reads that they need to organize a speak out campaign so that passengers can speak out against drivers. And the fourth is that maximum driving hours need to be legislated for drivers. The fifth basically mentions the speak out campaign again. But my point is that the legislation is already there. They could actually enforce it, and it kind of ties into the IRP and all of that stuff. Like, these documents are great documents. They really are. I think 5 mentions for the biggest transportation mechanism in our country is maybe a bit little.
But remember that it is a document about safety, and there the number is 3/36, is 8% of just the data point. I'm not.
I suppose. But the point is that it is kind of outlined. You know, what I found interesting about the tax cap 2.0 is that they introduced a new strategic partner with the update. One Anthus Service 84. Have you guys come across these guys? I went looking, and these people don't even have a website. But they do have, get this, Andrew, you're going to love this, a customized truck with which they can move their bailing machines to where they need them. And when you see said customized truck, you realize that there really isn't anything more special about it than putting a small crane on a flatbed. I quite enjoyed that. Eastern Cape medical scooters, anyone?
Well, frankly, I'd rather do business in the kind of realm of rolling your sleeves up and moving taxis around with someone who has a truck with a lift on it than with some oak who has a website.
But for the Minister of Transport to say that they're the technical partner and the reason for that is because of this customized truck.
Talking about organizations that don't have websites, I tried to visit the Santaka website today, which obviously they haven't paid to update their domains.
Oh, really?
It's plastered big letters across their website,
If you own this
cancelled due to
domain.
non-payment.
Oh shit! It's not even if you own this domain, come and claim it. Hey? It's cancelled. They want to flip and rub it in there.
The mafia does not need a website.
They've got a
$4
kick-ass
billion
Facebook
behind
page,
on their payments.
So, in the same article that I read, Minister Mbalula carried on to say that as technical partner, Anthus is responsible for the administration and management of the program. But actually, none of that matters too much because, in fact, the process will be handled by a special purpose vehicle. And as soon as I hear those words, I want to throw tables across the room. But the SPV is jointly owned by Anthus, 40%, and the taxi industry, which owns 60%. So the people running the program and the ones set to benefit from the program, which it specifically states, are the people in the system that they are trying to set out to regulate.
What does the program do? Sorry, I missed that part.
That is the recapitalization 2.0.
So they would make money out of the taxis being brought in and scrapped and taken apart.
They would, yeah, but
I think that's a
they
good
also
incentive.
have to. They are part of the policing mechanism that is
I
created.
like that. If the police are the people making money,
How
out
many
of the
times
mob
have you
being
said that you
enforced?
can't
The whole
negotiate with the
problem-
mob?
No, now you've given the mob shareholding and
But also,
getting it done.
the whole problem in the taxi industry is that it's largely been left to self-regulation, and clearly it's shown that they have no interest in regulating.
Well, they do
themselves.
now. They have a 60% profit share interest. The one place you can appeal to the mob is money. So if this vehicle would make money,
But
then
wasn't our point that they're just going to take the money and then do their own thing
they
anyway?
only get the money if they do the recapitalization. They don't get the money for free. You've got to drive a taxi in there and take it apart.
I mean,
and so forth.
go sit in Minister Mbalula's office and tell him that. Joe.
Yeah, I tried, but he wouldn't see me.
Oh, we
was at
need to get him on the
Gucci shopping.
We need to get him on the show, actually.
You'll be able to clear the dance floor.
and like the headroom on the amps and stuff would need to be massive. I don't think we could fit him in the studio. Anyway, he goes on to say, goes on and on about nice words like catalysts, unity, and skills development. But that's just it. Nice words.
I think to Rob's point, it's not a regulation issue for two reasons. One, you can't regulate the mob. Two, we're not very good at enforcing regulation in this country, unfortunately. But the private sector is very good at being innovative and interesting. And your idea of a kind of loyalty program, insurance-based, telematics is a word I saw a lot in the articles, kind of telematics enforced program. And then the other thing that you can incentivize the mob by giving them shareholding in the outcome you want. There's something there.
My point on the data thing is that if you're in app development or in IT, develop an app that is Uber for the informal sector. Can you imagine?
Amen, brother.
So,
Amen.
like, all the drivers have phones, like the Uber model, but you give people an option to maybe band together to order a taxi on their own, off their own phone. But it like solves a lot of issues, you know, and through strengthened relationships that are kind of interpersonal, like we've seen with Uber, you have consistent work. You know, people get Uber to fetch their kids every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday because whatever they can't take them to work, and that could be the same thing. And it offers obviously security for the drivers in terms of income, a direct link between the people and the drivers, which was your point, Rob, and security for the commuters, knowing that they'd rather go with a person with a looked after taxi than one with not, or rather with a person that's not drunk than one that is drunk all the time.
There's lots there. I think it's a very interesting idea.
Yeah. And just to reiterate what Joe said, on an interpersonal level, some of the small things are obvious. When he cuts you off, let him go in. Maybe just consider what he's been through that day. And if you're a commuter, maybe you can opt to support companies which don't encourage the use of substances among their staff, or elect to only take rides in roadworthy vehicles. I know these are very far removed from kind of reality, but small changes like that can actually make the difference, you know? Find out who owns the taxis that operate on your route. If there is an alternative, tell the one guy that you'll only ride in safe taxis. And if you're a taxi owner, why don't you give your drivers employment contracts? Give them benefits. See what kind of talent you can pull. And maybe you could create marketing around that fact to encourage commuters to favor your taxis above the rest. Because you take care of your drivers and you care about their families. Or perhaps you can undertake to have like a true 100% roadworthiness record, that you have all your vehicles on the go every year. I think you could charge a premium for that. Most of the stories that I hear from commuters is that taxis are unsafe. And as an owner, you could definitely charge a premium, I feel. Even though that premium might be small, we've said that the margins are razor thin anyway.
You put a little sticker on the taxi that says, "Our taxis are roadworthy." Worth the extra £2. Yeah.
That should be implicit in the fucking license disc. Maar no, ja, Andrew.
You know what? It occurs to me that so long as corrupt people in government are working with organized criminals to run something, there may not be a plan good enough to make things work, or you know, there may be no right amount of money required there because it's just it's not a workable dynamic. One thing that I think would be really interesting to try is to get rid of personal vehicles in busy areas. I think that'd do, like Rob said, be a good kind of disruptor for the industry to maybe try and bring in more players, and at the same time, you can get rid of so much parking that you could use that space for low-income housing. You know, trying to address the spatial apartheid a bit there as well.
Thank you, Andrew.
Certainly something I'd like to see tried.
Giannis?
My takeaways would be that the taxi industry is a multifaceted and complicated thing, as are so many things in this country, and that we must have empathy and sympathy for the drivers who are in many cases effectively wage slaves, and simultaneously high degrees of skepticism and maybe even emotive action to campaign against the mafia-like organizations that run it. That's all I got. And imali yesokisi. Foot on the brake, let them in. They'll smile at you, I promise. They do it to me.
My takeaway is the taxi industry, like any business or any industry, is there to service a need. And that means if we're talking about disruption, we're talking about wanting this thing to fundamentally change, you have to change the way that need looks. Only by doing that are we going to have any kind of change. You can't force regulation that's not going to change the dynamics, that's not going to change the circumstances that led to the industry being the way it is. You have to change those circumstances.
That's power.
Well made, Rob. I don't think I have anything to add.
I was going to say, Neil, your closing thoughts.
No, I think you guys have said it all. I think it's a very complicated issue, but the government needs to get a handle on it in whatever way they can. But I think the first thing that they need to do is create a focus around it and support the industry. And maybe that's the easiest way to kind of get some sort of application of regulations and things like that. But I think the industry is prime for disruption, like we've said. So, yeah. Thanks a lot for joining us, everyone. Thank you to my comrades, Mr. Rob Cass, Mr. Jonas Landman, Mr. Andrew Park, and our technician, Mr. Francois de Villiers. Good night.